listener production.
A warning. This episode contains references to the abuse of children. The number for LifeLine is 13 11 14.
And I wrote a report and I used the terms allegation of the administration of LSD into children and allegations of child theft.
Have you ever heard of the Australian cult, The Family? It was led by a woman named Anne Hamilton-Byrne.
All the followers believe that she is Jesus Christ reincarnated in the female form.
How did she control her followers? How did the police eventually catch her? And what happened to the dozens of children that were in the care of the family?
This actually happened in the suburbs and to the eastern hills of Melbourne.
Lex de Man investigated the family for more than 4 years and helped rescue dozens of children from the abuse of Anne Hamilton-Byrne and her followers.
Because cult leaders, they want two things: power and wealth.
In this rewind episode of Crime Insiders Detectives, Lex de Man takes host Brent Sanders through the case in exclusive detail and explains how he and the Victorian Police were able to arrest and charge Anne Hamilton-Byrne.
December 1987, I was one of two detectives on the on-call crew one weekend. And on the Saturday night, there was a fire in the Monbulk Catholic Primary School in Monbulk, which is in the Mount Dandenong area of Melbourne. So it's to the east of Melbourne, about an hour. And so we fronted up on the Sunday morning to have a look at the scene, as it was a school fire, and the arson squad was always called school fires. And with a school fire, the first thing you think of is, who's the teacher? Because often if it's set in a school room, it's often a vendetta against a school teacher. So I had a look at the fire and we were waiting for the forensic chemist to come up. And I said to the local senior constable, are there any children in this primary school that had any issues with the teacher from the school, from this classroom? And he told me about a young fellow by the name of then Roland Whittaker. And he was telling me about Roland as a child associated with the family cult. And I'd had no idea then what he was talking about. But he told me the story about this religious cult that was based in Ferny Grove, which is basically the next suburb from Monbulk in the Mount Dandenong area. And this person, this woman, who has all these followers and runs this eclectic cult, this religion, and all the followers believe that she is Jesus Christ reincarnated in the female form. I then met also that morning the local police doctor, Ed Ogden, and Ed had been involved in a raid that had happened in August of that year, so some 3 months earlier, where the children of Anne Hamilton-Byrne, the alleged children, had been removed from a property at Lake Eildon where they had been secreted and where they were living and educated. And that's about 2.5 hours northeast of Melbourne on the shores of Lake Eildon. And he's telling me this story and he said to me, don't get involved. If you get involved, this will be with you for life. And I'm a bit of a, I don't sit back. I want to get involved. I want to know more about this. And so Edward also had told me that the older child that had been released was actually at a flower show that particular afternoon, as he was taking care of her and him and his wife were taking care of her whilst her other brothers and sisters, allegedly, brothers and sisters, were at the St John family home down in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, and she was out for the day with them. So I met Sarah. This is the first time I met Sarah. And just the very strange look on Sarah. It was as if just piercing eyes looking straight through me, didn't want to talk, was in the corner of this flower show. So that was my first experience with Sarah, the oldest of the kids. So after about 3 months, we're told to drop the case, the arson. We weren't getting anywhere with an offender. We might have had a name. There was no proof. It was just innuendo. and I was working in just Russell Street Police Station as a uniformed sergeant, I was given up a 2-week window of opportunity to write a report. And I wrote a report and I used the terms allegation of the administration of LSD into children and allegations of child theft. And so the police department couldn't ignore not doing anything about it. The report ended up at the drug squad, and in December 1989, I was called to a meeting and of the then chief inspector of the drug squad telling me that a bit upset that I'd used a few words that meant that his department had to look into this thing, and said I was on a task force. I walked into a room the next day and there was a senior sergeant, Peter Spence, who was an amazing investigator, tremendous bloke who's sadly no longer with us, and 4 detectives, 2 males, 2 females. None of us knew each other. There was no resources, 4 desks, 2 typewriters, and we were told, right, you got 12 weeks, clean it up. Well, that was some 4.5 years later that it finished, and I was the only one of the original 6 that was there at the end. What had happened was in the late 70s, late 60s, early 70s and through the 70s, the social welfare system wasn't as good as it is today, and an unmarried 16, 15, 16, 17-year-old was shamed in society. So their mothers, thinking they were doing the right thing, would withdraw that child, their daughter who fell pregnant, from society for 9 months. And a number of these young girls were cared for by doctors who were cult members. I didn't know, but they were cult members. So when the children were born, they had the baby, they were told the child would go to a good home through adoption. They went straight into the sect and Anne made them her kids. There was one instance where a child was born in a hospital, delivered by a sect midwife, doctor, handed to a nurse, sect nurse, and handed to Anne within 20 minutes of birth and off in a taxi. Now, this is what happened in those days. Anne had total obedience from her followers. There was a fellow by the name of Dr. Rayner Johnson who was a physicist in the United Kingdom. He'd actually worked on the Manhattan Project. Some people might remember the Manhattan Project from recent films. And he was one of the physicists on that project. And he had been recruited by Melbourne University for the position of Master of Queens. Master of Queens was the top academic position in Victoria. And remembering that in the 60s and the early 70s, it was only about 3% of the Victorian society that went to university. It was the top people. They became lawyers, they became judges, they became doctors and real professional, in that professional field. And for them, in their professions, be it a lawyer or a senior nurse or an architect who designed many of Melbourne's top buildings, when they had a bit of trauma in their life, they would suffer what we today would call mental illness. Today we would praise the person for coming out and saying, I'm not feeling well, I need help. But in those days, it was taboo. They could lose their whole law career or their professional career, whatever profession they were in. They would be administered to New Haven Private Psychiatric Hospital here in Normandy Road Q, which is a pretty close eastern suburb to the city of Melbourne. And they would go there so no one knew that they were receiving mental health treatment. And at that time, there was a fellow by the name of Dr. Howard Whittaker, who was authorised by the Health Department of Victoria, along with another doctor, Dr. John McKay, to administer the drug LSD, an hallucinogenic drug. So these people would go into the hospital. The hospital was actually owned by a cult member. So Anne had complete run of the hospital. They would, at night, their first night that they would be in bed, the door would open, no light on, but they would see this figure in the doorway. And this figure would be in a white gown, flowing gown. And there would be smoke, mist coming up behind this figurine, who was actually Anne. and the smoke was dry ice in a bucket. And under the drug, LSD, they were indoctrinated that they were seeing the Messiah. They were seeing Anne Hamilton-Byrne. She was Jesus Christ. Bang. They're indoctrinated. And that's how many of them became followers of Anne Hamilton-Byrne. You know, the case itself was blown open by the assistance of her former lawyer, a fellow by the name of Peter Kibbe, who is no longer with us. And Peter had a obsessive compulsive. He was a top academic in law, and Peter had a problem called obsessive compulsiveness, where he was clean. He was obsessed with cleanliness. It would take him 2 to 3 hours to have a shower in the morning. He couldn't hold a job down in law. He went to New Haven to get some private psychiatric treatment, and that's what happened to Peter. Sometime later, as a cult member and as the lawyer for Anne Hamilton-Byrne and the cult, Peter falsified most of the documentation. Peter assisted in making single kids into triplets, into twins, either in Victoria or Western Australia or New South Wales or in New Zealand. The New Zealand's an interesting one. He made twins in New Zealand on the birth, deaths and marriages registry over there, and a few years later wrote back with a couple of references signed by a couple of doctors and social workers and nurses, all cult members, said to the authorities in New Zealand, sorry, at the time, and this was Anne's deposition to them, at the time of giving birth, I actually didn't give birth to twins, it was triplets. I forgot to tell you about the third one. So they re-registered the births to be triplets. We got to the point where we had the children. We had the children from the raid that had happened in August 87. And the house at Eildon was on the shores of Lake Eildon. So on a very remote road called Taylor Bay Road. And the children were living there, and they were cared for by one of 2 aunties who were nurses. And when I say aunties, they were cult members. And they would work 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. They'd be up at Eildon 2 weeks on. They would be providing the food and so forth. And when they weren't there, they'd be working in Melbourne hospitals to raise the money to buy the food and to raise the kids at Eildon. So Anne never put a hand in her pocket. And the house was where the children were educated. They fooled the education department. The main room was turned into a classroom when the education department came along and checked the school. The curriculum was set by a principal at a school in Ferntree Gully, which was part of the Mount Dandenong area. He too was a cult member. He would go every weekend, set the curriculum. Now, this is a person that was dealing with normal kids in society, but he was a religious zealot nut that followed Anne Hamilton-Byrne. The children also, there was a trapdoor in the house that they were told that when the police come, get under the house, hide, because the purpose of police in society is to collect and shoot children. That was the sole purpose of police in their mind. These kids didn't know what a birthday was. They didn't know, during their time there, they didn't know what their birthdays, they didn't know what Christmas was. And when one of the dogs died at the Eildon house, if the dog liked one of the children, the child was placed on the floor, slept on the floor for 3 days. The dog was placed in the bed for 3 days mourning with candles around the dog. So I'm trying to paint a picture of how bizarre this group was. The kids basically, cabbage, potato and cabbage was basically their diet. All their hair was peroxide blonde except for one, that was Sarah, who was a redhead. And at one stage, Anne had a fascination with the Von Trapp family singers from The Sound of Music. She actually dressed them all up the same, the blonde hair, and they entered into the Dandenong Folk Festival, which is a large suburban area to the east of Melbourne. And when the children, it was deemed the children played up, they received some really harsh punishment, terrible punishment. They were beaten with a stick. They had their heads dunked in buckets of water until they could hardly breathe and so forth. And this was done by the aunties. Anne was hardly ever there. Anne was mostly overseas. The telephone would be held out so that Anne and her husband Bill could hear the punishment being administered to the child. And so this whole school, this whole house, is where the children, who all believed they were the natural children of Anne and William Hamilton-Byrne. That's what they came to believe. Now, that was my journey over the next 4 years. So, Operation Forest started in the December of 1989. Peter Spence located some documents that Peter Kibbe had falsified, which was perjury. These were legal documents with the adoption of a couple of births and the sale of property. So one Monday morning, Peter and I front up at a little place called Camperdown down in Western Victoria, about 2.5, 3 hours out of Melbourne. And 9 o'clock in the morning, we arrest Peter. We walk him across the road in a small little town. Of course, little towns talk. The local solicitor has been arrested, and we charged him with the perjury. And we gave him the option, if he turned Queen's evidence, in other words, if he told us what he knew about the cult, I would hop in the witness box in the county court and give character evidence on the perjury charge that he was fronting the court. We wouldn't drop it, but I'd hop in and give perjury character evidence. And he's the only one I've ever done that with and for, and I'm glad I did. So a week later, Peter says to us, after we've arrested him and charged him, come and see me. So we go up to his home, and by this time he's got no job in Camperdown. He's back at home in Olinda, which is, again, next to Ferny Creek, all in the Mount Dandenong area. And he said, all right, I had a falling out with Anne. Anything I can help you with, I will. So for the next 3 months, I would pick Peter up on a Monday, and this would happen on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We'd drive to the office in Melbourne, and I would sit down and go through documentation and get the story. And about 365 handwritten pages later, we've got all the information that Peter had. And it was through Peter that one of the two aunties that I spoke about before in Eildon, she was living in the United Kingdom. She said she would talk to us, but she wouldn't talk to us in Australia. So through a very funny circumstance, I got very quick approval to go to the United Kingdom and work with the extradition squad in the Met, and also the Hampshire Constabulary with one of our female detectives for 3 months. And we got her side, we got her story from there. And to cut the long story short, using Peter's assistance and other information and so forth, we had an international arrest warrant issued for Anne and William on perjury charges and other charges. For the last 12 months, I was the senior investigator, the senior sergeant on the task force. I was given 12 months to clean it up when they appointed me with a small team that I had at that stage. And you got to remember, this is pre-internet. This is pre-apps, pre-iPhone. And Sarah came into me one night and she said, rang me one night on my home phone, and she said, I think Anne's in the United States. She's just rung me. Right. So what do we do with this information? Next morning, pick up the phone, say to the international operator, as you used to in those days, go through the international operator, can you connect me with the office, the FBI office in New York City? The phone rings, and it's picked up by an FBI agent there by the name of Hilda Kogut. And my first words to her was, now don't hang up. I'm not a nut. Let me introduce myself. I told her this story, and Hilda could tell that we were genuine. And we then started to fax documents, not PDF, but fax by them fax machines. Long story short, they located Anne in the Catskill Mountains where she had a home, where the cult had a home, arrested her. She fought the extradition for about 6 weeks until there was her husband, Bill, was in a separate cell in a separate prison. There was a murder in his cell, and he said, that's it, I'm coming home. And we brought them home. I remember the first time I saw her. The first time I saw Anne was on the tarmac at JFK Airport. And this black van turns up, which was the FBI, and the door opens up, and here is this You would think a little granny, a crumpled up woman, no makeup, because Anne always wore wigs and was already done up. She was obviously a very charismatic and attractive woman in her earlier years. And I said to her, Anne Hamilton-Byrne, my name's Detective Senior Sergeant Lex de Man, charge you, da-da-da-da-da. The only word she said to me was, oh, you're a lot younger than I expected. Apart from the other two words, no comment, they're the only words that Anne ever spoke to me.
Coming up, what Lex discovered when he met Anne Hamilton-Byrne.
You said in a brilliant documentary, Lex, on Netflix, that on that first time that you saw Anne Hamilton-Byrne, you described as looking into the eyes of the devil.
It was, and I've used the term, she's the most evil person that I've ever come across in my personal and professional life, and I stand by that. When you understand the damage that this woman did to so many lives, what she did to the children, what she had caused to be done to the children, there is nothing more, but evil is the best word to describe her. She was a railway worker's daughter from country Victoria down east at Sale, about 4 hours from Melbourne. Her mother had been in a psychiatric hospital. She'd been married to a person in the Air Force, Riley. He died in a motor car accident. Bill, her second husband, she caused their marriage to break up. When she met Raina Johnson at Melbourne University in the 60s, when Raina first saw her at the door of his house on campus, they were having an afternoon tea, and he said, I have just met the Messiah. I have just met, because Raina was dabbling in Eastern mythology and Christianity, and he was, oh, for want of a better term, a brilliant kook. You know, someone that's got academically smart and whatever, but has just mentally lost the plot. That's how I would describe it. And it was when this happened that Anne started to use this, because he was one of the elites in Victoria. I mean, he would have morning or afternoon tea or lunch or dinners with governors and premiers and so forth. So he was able to open the door for Anne to a lot of people in society. And I remember, no names, no pactorial, a number of former senior leaders, politicians, that when shown a picture of them with Anne, they couldn't explain why they were with Anne. And that was frightening. You know, it's such a bizarre story, I know, that, you know, and the reason I wanted the film and why I talk on podcasts and do these types of interviews is to educate people that this isn't some bizarre Southern American cult sect. This actually happened in the suburbs and to the eastern hills of Melbourne. And could it happen again? The reporting processes and the requirements now are much, much tougher. So maybe not, but I wouldn't say no. I would never say no. Because cult leaders, they want two things: power and wealth. And never put her hand in her pocket. Her followers did. And she had complete control of people. If I was to say that there was a Dutch woman who went for an interview to be a house cleaner, the following week she was in London being a receptionist to a cult doctor, naturopath, and that woman's husband was in India. They never saw each other for 17 more years in 1 week. That was the power that the charismatic presence that Anne apparently had. I didn't see it, but, you know, this is how, and, you know, they built a church. They built a hall, Santa Keaton Lodge in the hills of Mount Dandenong, by cult members. You know, all these professional people, they contributed to it. In a number of the cult members' homes was a small room called the Blue Room, and it had a blue light. It was painted blue, and it has a small table, It has a picture of Anne Hamilton-Byrne. It has 3 crystals, blue, and the crucifix. And that's where they would go and pray for Anne, or pray in Anne's name. And this is people that were GPs in communities, that were educating children at schools, that are attending to the sick in hospitals.
You've gone as close to her as anybody has without, I guess, being within the family itself, but she would have had personality traits or means of which to bring people into that, which would be similar to other cults and other cult leaders. But in your experience, what was it? What did she have? What did she possess? How did she get her tentacles out there to bring these people in?
That's a good question. When you go back and I talk about the Master of Queen's College, Dr. Raina Johnson, it gave her standing. This is Victoria's top academic, introducing the Messiah to other professionals, and then introducing Anne as, he's Messiah, he's Jesus, she is Jesus. And then these people, and the people going through the mental health crisis in their life, one who was one of Melbourne's top leading architects, him and his wife, one of their children was killed in a motorbike accident and they just couldn't cope. He went and sought help at New Haven Private Psychiatric Hospital. He went through the LSD treatment. He saw Anne with the bucket of ice, the flowing gown and so forth. He was indoctrinated that I am the Messiah. I am the Messiah. His wife then, it just rippled out. The wife then followed. She became one of the family members as well, and one of the aunties. And this is how things would happen. She would create marriages. Peter Kibbe was given to a cult member. They married. They had 2 kids. She broke up marriages. No marriage survived. And it was through her standing at Melbourne University with Dr. Raina Johnson, and it was through the use of the private psychiatric hospital that she became the Jesus Christ in the eyes of many that she indoctrinated. At the height of this cult, there are over 500 people, we're told, 500 professionals in Victoria that went and followed Anne. And when you think about it, and 3% of people went to university, that's a lot of the 3%.
She led 2 lives, basically, in her sort of original, if you will, life, and her husband was killed in a fatal car accident. It was then she sort of seemed to go down this obsessive path of, she had a whole lot of plastic surgery. She sort of reinvented herself, and I think she had 1 child at that time, but always wanted more, but that was never going to happen because she was now a single woman, and at that time that you couldn't have more children, and she became obsessed with having children. I think at one point within the cult, within the family, were there 28 children that she believed were
claims,
yeah.
She claims in an interview with an amazing a reporter from A Current Affair, Murray Moore, who really brought this issue to really light in the late 80s, early 90s, and a great woman, that she said to Murray in this interview in Hawaii that 27 children went through my hands, 27. And she's got this bizarre look when asked. She says she loves them. It's just a look of evil when she says that to me on that video. But yes, 27. We located 13 when you were 13. Whether she was fantasising about the other 14 or whatever, I don't know. But there were 13. And one of the hardest parts about the task force is getting the confidence of the children, and the detectives did a great job in getting that and getting their statements that what the children thought, but then explaining to the children that they're not Anne and William's children, that they actually have other parents. And then going along as a detective, and I remember going along a number of houses, mainly in country Victoria, and knocking on the door and saying to a woman, I need to have a chat with you privately, and explaining, and the look of horror on their face and saying, I need you to supply a vial of blood through your doctor. Then doing the same with men, and they didn't have an idea, a clue that they were a father. And many of the women thought that part of their life had been parked, that no one knew. And they moved on and had their own families and children and so forth, And then a number of the maternal and paternal parents, when I knocked on the door and they opened it up, I went, yep, you're the mum. You could just tell. Yep, it was right there. Some children look like their parents. Yep, that's what it was like. And then, introducing them and so forth, and not only ourselves, but also social welfare services, community services. And, many of them, all of them, they've gone on to be absolutely wonderful humans. These survivors, and I call them survivors. Many of them a number of them have married. A number of them have got children of their own, grandchildren. They've built careers and so forth. And when you think of what they've gone through, the resilience that they've shown, I take my hat off to them. And even to this day, I'm still in touch with a number of them. And I'm just in awe of them, how they've rebuilt themselves.
Lex, you meet this woman, Anne Hamilton-Byrne, on the runway, JFK Airport, and you're there in your role, Australian Police, to extradite her back to Australia to face charges. There were some pretty tough decisions that had to be made by you and others with regards to what charges were going to be laid, the scope of them, and also, do we want those kids who have gone through so much to have to go through a court process? What were the decisions made around that, Lex?
I remember the words when I got the phone call from Hilda Koga, the FBI agent in New York City, the night that the phone rang at midnight. And we were in the office at midnight because they were doing the raid in the morning. And she said these words, "We've got the bitch." I lost the plot. I went into the kitchen and I threw the chairs around. I broke down. And I unashamedly tell people this to say, this is the impact that your job can have on you, and you will. If you have a breakdown, you can deal with it. Tell people about it, because you give the license to others to deal with emotional stress at points of time in your work life. So in the last 12 months of the task force, when we were putting the charges together, we had a Crown prosecutor working with the task force. She was amazing. She subsequently became a county court judge, Caroline Douglas. And the thing I struggled with was, we're being told of allegations of, the beatings and so forth for the children, etc., and understanding what they had been through, taking on board the impact in the effect on their mental health and the effect on their putting this issue behind them. Did we really want to put them in front of a jury and allow Anne Hamilton-Byrne to destroy them once more? So the decision was made, no. We would go only on the paperwork, the falsification of the documents, the perjury on the documents, because the documents don't lie. People lie on documents. So we were able to prove that the contents of the documents were false. And what did we really want out of this? We wanted justice. We wanted to show her followers she's not Jesus Christ. And Mari's words always rang in my mind, you'll never find her. If you find her, you'll never charge her. If you charge her, you'll never bring her back. If you bring her back, you'll never get a conviction. Anne said guilty in the court. She pleaded guilty in the court. And there was a lot of legal discussion and argument going on between Victoria and New Zealand with regards to the New Zealand charges I mentioned before about triplets and so forth. And it was decided we could only proceed on the perjury charges on the Victorian documents and so forth, which was a real shame. It was a real shame. We also wanted to make sure the children understood that Anne wasn't the Messiah. She'd actually been an evil woman. And by then the kids knew what had happened. It was a hard decision not to say we're not going to proceed on the allegations of the assaults, etc., and the beatings and so forth. But to this very day, I'm glad we made that decision. And I'm glad the DPP supported us in that decision. At the end of the day, what did Anne get? She pleaded guilty and got a $5,000 fine. Through that task force, a number of members of the task force left because of the impact of taking the statements on them personally. They had their own issues to deal with. There's another one who sadly is no longer with us. In more recent years, Sarah, who struggled with herself with, her life that had occurred, passed away. And, I was honoured to be able to say some words, or I say the eulogy at her service. And I remember turning up there and a couple of cult members turned up. I've got to tell you, they quickly left. They quickly left because I think that anger that I have for Anne, even though she's now gone, is still there. I'll protect these survivors, anything I can do, and I know others would do the same thing.
Lex, I want to thank you so much for the time. Thank you for the work that you put in, both in your time in the job and since. And you have made such a positive difference to so many people during your time policing and since. And it's an absolute pleasure to meet you. Thanks very much.
Thank you for the time for me to tell the story. Thank you.
That's all we have time for in this Rewind episode. If you know someone who loves true crime, recommend our series to them. And check out our favourite clips. Search Listener Crime on TikTok or Instagram. I'm Dan Mullins, with sound designed by Niall Fernandez. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.